There is a body lying outside the gates of a small city in the mountains of what is now central Turkey. The year is somewhere around 48. The city is called Lystra, and the crowd standing over the body has just finished stoning it. Stoning is not quick, and it is not clean. It is an execution designed for participation. A death by committee. Rock after rock, from ordinary hands. Farmers' hands. Merchants' hands. Until the thing on the ground stops moving. Then they dragged him outside the walls and left him for the dogs and the birds. Because that is what you do with garbage. And here is what you need to know about that crowd. 15 minutes earlier, they were trying to worship him. That same afternoon, this man had healed a crippled beggar in their marketplace. And the whole city decided the gods had come down in human form. They called him Hermes, messenger of the gods. The priest of Zeus was already dragging sacrificial bulls toward the gates. Garlands ready, the full civic honors. And the man had torn his own clothes and shouted at them to stop. We are only human beings like you. And somehow, in the space of a quarter hour, adoration curdled into rage, and the hands that were reaching to crown him picked up stones instead. From god to corpse in one afternoon. That is how fast a crowd turns. So now he is lying in the dirt, and a small circle of believers gathers around the body, the way you gather around a grave. And the body opens its eyes. He gets up. He stands, bloodied, dust in his wounds. And the record says he did something that no survival instinct on earth can explain. He did not run for the hills. He walked back through the gates, into the same city, past the same hands. Stop right there, because I want you to look at that decision the way a detective looks at a piece of evidence that does not fit. Ordinary courage does not do this. Ordinary courage has a limit, a floor, a point where it says, I have given enough. Whatever made that man turn around and walk back into Lystra is something else. Something that needs explaining. And it was not just him. Over the next 3 decades, this same inexplicable behavior shows up in fishermen, in tent mockers, in businesswomen, in household slaves, in people whose names history barely caught, scattered across the largest empire the world had ever seen. People who could have stayed quiet, and safe, and alive, and kept choosing not to. One man decided to find out why. He was a physician, a Greek, an educated outsider, the only Gentile author in your entire Bible. And he opens his work with a claim that sounds less like scripture and more like a case file. I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning. Investigated, interviewed the eyewitnesses, traced the events, checked the record. His name was Luke. And the report he produced runs exactly 28 chapters. And it is the file we are opening tonight. Because buried in those 28 chapters is the answer to one of the strangest questions in human history. How did 120 terrified people, hiding behind a locked door in an occupied city, with no money, no army, no status, and a founder who had just been publicly executed, become a movement so unstoppable that within 1 generation, their enemies stood up in a courtroom and described them with a sentence that is either an accusation or the greatest compliment ever paid. These men, who have turned the world upside down, have come here also. We are going through all 28 chapters of that file, but not the way you march through a table of contents. We are going through it the way an investigator reads evidence, looking for the thing the witnesses themselves could never quite name. And the investigation does not begin in Lystra, with the man who walked back in. It begins 20 years earlier, in a rented room upstairs, in a city that wanted them dead, behind a door nobody had the courage to open. Start with the room. Because the whole file starts with a room, an upper room in Jerusalem. Spring, roughly the year 33. About 120 people inside. The door is shut, and it is shut for a reason 40 days ago. This city executed their leader as a public spectacle, and the men who arranged it are still in power, still holding office. A 15-minute walk away. If this movement has a future, nobody in the room can see it. They have no plan for Rome. Most of them have never left Galilee and Judea. They are not drafting a strategy for world influence. They are doing the one thing they were told to do, which is the hardest assignment in the file. Wait. Now find one face in that room, because the whole first act of this story runs through him. Peter, fisherman, big talker, the one who always spoke first and thought second. And I need you to remember, with some precision, the last time Peter stood near a fire in this city. It was the night of the arrest, in a courtyard, and a servant girl looked at him a moment too long and said, "You were with him, not a governor, not a soldier with a sword, a girl, at a charcoal fire." And Peter swore an oath that he had never met the man. 3 times before sunrise. That is the last public statement on record from the future first preacher of the Christian church. Hold on to that. The file is going to come back for it. And notice what Luke, our investigator, chooses to record about those waiting days, because it tells you what kind of writer he is. He records a business meeting. The group needs to replace Judas. So they nominate 2 men. They pray. They cast lots. And a believer named Matthias fills the vacancy. And then Matthias is never mentioned again in the entire New Testament. Friend, if you are inventing a legend, you cut that scene. Legends do not have minutes and procedure. Case files do. That boring little election is one of 100 fingerprints in this document that read less like myth and more like a man writing things down because they happened. Then comes the morning of Pentecost. And to feel it, you have to see what Jerusalem looked like that week. Pentecost was one of the great pilgrimage feasts, and the city was swollen to several times its size, packed with Jewish pilgrims from everywhere the map went. Luke actually lists them, like a customs officer reading manifests Parthians, Magi's, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Egypt, the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome. Read that list on a map sometime. It is the known world, folded into one city, for 1 week. If you wanted a message to travel every road in the empire at once, there was exactly 1 morning in the ancient calendar to light the match. And that is the morning the room exploded. A sound like violent wind, fire that divided and rested on each of them. Each one, the fisherman and the nobody alike, and 120 people who had been whispering behind a bolted door came pouring down the stairs into the most dangerous streets in their world, speaking languages they had never learned. And every pilgrim in that polyglot crowd heard about the works of God in the accent of home. Now, you can get lost in the spectacle of that, and most retellings do. But an investigator does not stare at the fireworks. He watches what changed. So watch the reversals, because they happen in a single morning. A locked door becomes an open street. One language becomes every language. A local grief becomes a global announcement. And a man who folded in front of a servant girl stands up in front of thousands, in the city that crucified his teacher, within earshot of the men who did it, and raises his voice. And what Peter says is not a self-help talk. It is a witness statement. This Jesus, whom you crucified, God has raised from the dead, and we are all witnesses of it. That word, Witnesses, martyrs in Greek, is going to run through this entire file like a red thread. And it is going to cost some of these people everything. Peter is not offering the crowd a philosophy that might improve their lives. He is testifying to an event, a body that was dead on Friday and was not dead on Sunday. And he is staking his life on the claim in the one city on earth where the tomb could be checked. The record says the crowd was cut to the heart. It says about 3,000 people believed and were baptized that day. 3,000 on day one in the executing city. So here is the first finding of this investigation. And it is stranger than a miracle. The movement that would outlast the Roman Empire did not begin with a strategy. It did not begin with a charismatic founder working the crowds, because the founder had left. It began with 120 ordinary, frightened, recently failed people doing nothing but waiting and praying in a rented room. And with a God who apparently prefers to start world-changing things with exactly that kind of person. Write that down if you have ever felt too ordinary to matter to God. The file opens with people hiding, but a crowd is a crowd. 3,000 people saying yes in the emotion of a festival morning. That is remarkable, and it proves very little. Because crowds evaporate. Every politician and every revivalist knows it. The real question is, what happens when the festival ends? The pilgrims go home, and the men who run this city, the same court that condemned Jesus 5 weeks ago, look down from their chambers and realize the thing they killed did not stay dead. They are about to find out that it can walk right up to their front gate. Every city has people it has learned not to see. In Jerusalem, one of them sat at the temple's most beautiful entrance. He was a beggar, crippled from birth. And Luke, ever the physician, quietly notes his age in the file, over 40 years old. Do the arithmetic on that number, because it is one of the saddest sums in the New Testament. Carried every morning to the gate called Beautiful, and sat down on the stones to ask coins from people on their way to pray. For decades, which means, almost certainly, he was sitting at that gate in the years when a rabbi from Nazareth walked through it. Jesus passed this way. The man was here, and there was no miracle for him then. Whatever the reason, his healing was not scheduled for the days when healing was famous. His was scheduled for an ordinary afternoon. The 3 o'clock prayers, when 2 fishermen with empty pockets stopped in front of his mat. Silver and gold I do not have, Peter says, but what I do have, I give you, in the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Walk, and 40+ years of locked bones let go. The man is up, walking, then leaping, holding on to Peter, making an absolute scene in the temple courts. And the crowd that gathers recognizes him, because of course they do. They have been stepping past him their whole lives. He is not a stranger claiming a miracle. He is the fixture at the gate, the man everyone knew and nobody saw, standing on his own 2 feet. That detail matters to an investigator. The evidence was a person the whole city could cross-examine. The authorities moved fast. Peter and John spent that night in custody, and the next morning they were marched in front of the Sanhedrin, the same council, in all likelihood many of the same faces that had condemned Jesus weeks earlier. I want you to stand where Peter is standing and feel the geometry of that moment. The last time this court met about this movement, its founder was sentenced and crucified, and Peter was outside in the dark, swearing to a servant girl that he did not know the man. Now Peter is inside, in the defendant's place, looking at the judges. Same city, same court, same question. Are you with him? And the man who broke in a courtyard does not break in the courtroom. Luke records the council's own bewilderment. They saw the courage of Peter and John, and they took note that these were unschooled, ordinary men. Ordinary. The council's word. Not mine. Sitting right there, in chapter 4 of the file. And it might as well be the thesis of the whole book. The judges had a problem, and they knew it. The healed man was standing right there. 40 years of public evidence on 2 working legs. And half of Jerusalem had watched him leap. You cannot execute your way out of that. So they reached for the tool. Bureaucracies always reach for a gag order. Speak no more in this name. And Peter and John give the answer that becomes the engine of the next 26 chapters. As for us, we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard. Look closely at the shape of that sentence, because it is legal language. Witness language. They do not say, "We find this teaching meaningful." They do not say, "This philosophy works for us." They say, "We saw something. We heard something. And you are asking us to commit perjury by silence." You can command a debater to drop an argument. What exactly do you do with a witness who will not unsee? Meanwhile, back in the growing community, something almost more shocking than the miracles is happening. People are selling property, fields, houses, liquidated. The money laid at the apostles' feet, distributed to anyone in need. And Luke reports the astonishing bottom line. There were no needy persons among them. No needy persons. In first-century Jerusalem, a city with beggars at every gate. Understand, no one ordered this. There is no command in the file. No pledge drive. No tax. Something had gotten into these people's relationship with their own possessions and loosened it at the root. Grace, it turns out, shows up in the ledger before it shows up anywhere else. A man named Joseph from Cyprus sells a field, and the apostles nickname him Barnabas, son of encouragement. Flag that name. The file will need him later. Badly. Now, if the record were legend, this is where the early church would glow in soft focus forever. It is not. And it does not. And what Luke writes next is the reason I trust him. A married couple, Ananias and Sapphira, watch believers like Barnabas being loved and honored for their generosity. And they want that, not the giving, the being seen giving. So they sell a property, quietly keep back part of the price, and present the rest as the whole. A small piece of image management. The kind of thing every fundraiser in history has winked at. And Peter names it for what it is. Not a budgeting choice, but a lie told to God in the middle of a community whose entire currency is truthful witness. And first, Ananias, then his wife, falls dead, carried out and buried the same day. Whatever you make of that severity, and honest readers have wrestled with it for 2,000 years. Notice what its presence in the file tells you. Luke kept it. He is writing the origin story of his own movement. The founding weeks. The honeymoon. And he includes the day the honeymoon produced 2 funerals and a scandal of hypocrisy at the heart of the fellowship. Here is the second finding of the investigation. This record is believable, precisely because it refuses to airbrush its heroes. The first church was not a perfect community. It was a community where fear, vanity, and dishonesty showed up in week 1, sitting in the good seats, and the mission did not die of it. The authorities tried again. Of course, arrests, a night in the public jail, a strange dawn escape, another hearing, and this time they had the apostles flogged, 40 lashes minus 1 across the back, before releasing them with the same exhausted order, stop speaking. And the file says these ordinary men left the council bleeding and rejoicing that they had been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name, and went right back to the temple courts and the houses. Daily. Teaching. The movement had now survived the 2 forces that kill movements from above, and from below state pressure from outside. Corruption exposed inside. It was growing so fast that the count had gone from 3,000 to more than 5,000 men alone, plus women and children. And the arithmetic was becoming a logistics problem. And that is exactly where the next crack opened. Not from the palace, not from the council, from the food line. Because the next threat in the file is the quietest and the most dangerous one yet. And it started when somebody noticed which widows were being fed first. There is a woman standing in a food line in Jerusalem, and she has started counting. She is a widow, which in her world is not just a grief. It is an economic sentence. No husband means no income, no standing, no safety net except the charity of others. She is also a Greek-speaking Jew, what the file calls a Hellenist, part of the great tide of Jews who had grown up out in the diaspora, in Alexandria or Antioch or Cyrene, and had come home to Jerusalem to die near the temple, which means she prays the same prayers as everyone around her, but she prays them with an accent. And she has noticed something. Nobody announced it. Nobody voted on it. But day after day, in the daily distribution of food, the widows who speak Aramaic, the local ones, the ones with family names people recognize, are served first, served better, remembered, and the widows with Greek accents are, somehow, reliably, overlooked. You do not need to read to see it. You just need to stand in the line and be hungry and watch. Now feel how dangerous this moment is, because it is a different species of threat from anything in the file so far. The council could not stop this movement with prison. Flogging could not stop it. Even hypocrisy in the ranks could not stop it. But this could, because this crack does not run between the church and its enemies. It runs straight through the middle of the church itself. Right along the oldest fault line, human community has language, culture, us and almost us. The community that claimed there were no needy persons among them has just discovered that need has been quietly sorted by accent. And every immigrant church, every merging congregation, every growing organization in history knows what usually happens next. The overlooked group leaves and starts its own thing. The founders call them divisive on the way out, and the movement splits before its 10th birthday. Watch what actually happens instead, because this is one of the most quietly radical scenes in the whole record. The complaint reaches the 12 apostles, and they do not do any of the things leaders reflexively do. They do not deny it. No one says our distribution is fair, and you are imagining things. They do not spiritualize it. No one tells the widows to focus on heavenly bread. They do not shoot the messengers or lecture anyone about unity. They say, in effect, you are right. This is real. And the structure that produced it has to change. Choose 7 men, full of the Spirit and wisdom, and we will hand this entire ministry over to them. And the community chooses 7. And Luke, the careful investigator, writes down all 7 names. Stephen, Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, Nicholas. Read that list out loud. Every single name is Greek. Every one. The church looked at the group that had been overlooked and did not offer them an apology and a slightly better place in line. It handed them the keys to the food supply. The offended minority was put in charge of the very system that had failed them. Friend, that is not first-century behavior. Most of the time. That is not 21st century behavior. Whatever was loose in these people's grip on money back in chapter 4 was apparently also loose in their grip on power. And the file adds, almost in passing, that after this, the word of God spread and the number of disciples multiplied greatly, and even a large number of priests believed. The crack, handled honestly, became a doorway. But the reason this episode matters to our investigation is what one of those 7 food administrators did next. Because the man at the top of the list, Stephen, was hired to wait on tables. And Stephen, it turns out, could not stay in his lane. The record says he did great wonders among the people, and that when men from the Greek-speaking synagogues rose to debate him, they could not stand up to the wisdom the Spirit gave him. So they did what losing debaters have done in every century. They stopped arguing about ideas and started arguing about the man. False witnesses, a blasphemy charge, and suddenly the table server is standing before the Sanhedrin, the same chamber that tried Jesus, the same chamber that flogged Peter, now looking at a volunteer from the catering committee. And Stephen delivers the longest speech in the entire book of Acts. Not Peter, not Paul, Stephen, a man with no title beyond servant, retelling Israel's whole story from Abraham forward, and driving toward a single searing point. God has never once been confined to this building, and every generation that thought it owned him ended up resisting him. The council hears where this is going, and the file says they were furious and gnashed their teeth at him. Then Stephen looks up and says he sees heaven open, and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. Standing, and the chamber erupts. They cover their ears. They scream. They drag him out of the city, and the stones begin. And in the middle of the stoning, Stephen does 2 things that should sound familiar. He prays, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." And then, on his knees, with the rocks still coming, he shouts, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them. Father, forgive them. Into your hands I commit my spirit." The man had absorbed his teacher's death so deeply that when his own came, it came out in the same words. The movement's first martyr died the way its founder died, praying for the men who were killing him. Here is the third finding of this investigation, and it cuts against every instinct of a celebrity culture in this file. There are no minor characters. The most powerful sermon in Acts came from a man hired to distribute bread. Keep that finding close, because it is about to be tested at scale. And then Luke does something that only a very deliberate writer does. In the middle of the execution scene, he freezes the frame on a detail that has nothing to do with Stephen. The witnesses, he writes, laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. A coat rack. In the climax of a martyrdom, the investigator makes sure you notice the coat rack. A young Pharisee, brilliant, zealous, standing at the edge of the killing ground, minding the cloaks, approving of every stone. Luke wants his name in your head, wants you to remember exactly where this man was standing and whose side he was on. Because the men who killed Stephen walked home that evening, believing they had silenced a voice. They had just lit a fire, and the wind was about to catch it. The morning after Stephen's funeral, the church in Jerusalem woke up to open season. The file is blunt about it on that day. A great persecution broke out against the church. And Saul, the young man from the coat rack, went from approving to organizing. Luke's language turns violent and specific. Saul began to destroy the church, going house to house, dragging off men and women, committing them to prison. House to house, door after door, families pulled apart at the threshold. This was not a mob's bad weekend. This was a systematic project, run by a gifted administrator with names and addresses. And the believers ran, thousands of them, out of Jerusalem, into the hills of Judea, north into Samaria, further, along the coast roads, carrying what they could. If you were standing in the smoke of that moment, You would call it what it looked like, the end. The movement had a capital, and the capital had fallen. Persecution was doing exactly what persecution is designed to do. Shrink a thing until it disappears. Except Luke, writing it down years later, chooses a strange word for what happened. He does not say the believers fled, or escaped, or were driven out. Though all of that was true, he says they were scattered. And the Greek word he picks, diaspero, is a farmer's word. It is what a sower does with seed. You do not scatter seed to destroy it. You scatter seed because you want a bigger harvest than one field can hold. And then Luke adds the sentence that turns the whole catastrophe inside out. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. Wherever they went. Not the apostles. Notice, the file specifically says the apostles stayed in Jerusalem. The scattering carried the ordinary ones, the nameless ones, the congregation, and everywhere the wind dropped them. They talked. The strategy session that launched Christianity's world mission was never held. Persecution drew up the itinerary, and refugees preached the routes. Saul thought he was stamping out embers. He was kicking them into dry grass. Follow one of those embers. Philip, number 2 on the food committee list. Stephen's colleague, lands in Samaria, of all places, and preaches Christ there, and the city breaks open with joy. You need the history to feel the scandal. Jews and Samaritans had despised each other for centuries. A feud of temple against temple, bloodline against bloodline, the kind of hatred with monuments. Good Jewish travelers crossed the river to avoid Samaritan soil. And the first great harvest outside Jerusalem happens in exactly the neighborhood the harvesters had been raised to hate. The gospel's first border crossing was not geographic. It was personal. Then the file gets stranger. An angel points Philip away from the revival, down a desert road toward Gaza. No explanation. And rolling along that road is a chariot carrying one of the most unexpected figures in the entire record, the treasurer of the kingdom of Ethiopia, a court official of the queen, wealthy, literate, powerful, and a eunuch. Hold that last word, because it is the key to the scene. This man had traveled hundreds of miles to worship at the temple in Jerusalem, and the law of Moses was explicit. A eunuch could not enter the assembly of the Lord. He could come near. He could never come in. He is, in one person, everyone who has ever stood at the edge of faith, drawn to a door they were told was closed to them. And he is riding home, reading Isaiah out loud, stuck on a passage about a sheep led to the slaughter. And he asks Philip the question every honest reader eventually asks, who is the prophet talking about? And beginning with that very scripture, Philip tells him about Jesus. They come to some water, and the man from the excluded nations, the man banned from the inner courts, says the sentence. The whole scene was built for look. Here is water. What can stand in the way of my being baptized? Nothing. That is the answer. Nothing stands in the way. The man goes down into the water, shut out, and comes up included, and rides on toward Africa rejoicing, carrying the message toward a continent before Peter has even left the country. Church tradition says Ethiopia's ancient church remembers him still. Meanwhile, the file cuts back to Saul, and the hunt is expanding. Jerusalem is no longer enough. He obtains extradition letters for Damascus, 150 miles north. Authorization to drag believers back in chains. He is on the road, close to the city. When the light hits, you know this scene, or you think you do. The blaze, brighter than noon. Saul on the ground. The voice Saul. Saul, why do you persecute me? Notice the pronoun. Me. Not my people. Not my church. Me. as if every door Saul had broken down had a single body behind it. And the persecutor is led into Damascus by the hand, blind, and for 3 days he does not eat or drink, sitting in the dark with the wreckage of his own certainty. But I want to move the camera, because the most important room in this chapter is not Saul's. Across the city, an ordinary believer, a man the file introduces simply as a disciple named Ananias, is having a vision of his own. And it contains the most terrifying sentence a Damascus Christian could hear. Go to the house of Judas on Straight Street and ask for Saul of Tarsus. Ananias knows the name. Everyone knows the name. And Luke, the honest investigator, records that Ananias argued, Lord, I have heard many reports about this man and all the harm he has done to your holy people in Jerusalem. And he has come here with authority to arrest all who call on your name. Translation, Lord, you are sending me to the man whose job is me. The answer that comes back is not reassurance. It is assignment. Go. This man is my chosen instrument. And Ananias goes. Somewhere on Straight Street, an ordinary man stands in front of a door, on the other side of which sits the most dangerous man in his world. And he knocks, walks in, finds the hunter blind and starving in the dark, and the first words out of his mouth, the first words Saul hears from the church he was destroying, are these, Brother Saul. Brother, no security screening, no probation period, no speech about what you did to us, a hand on the head of the persecutor, and a word that adopted him before he could prove anything. The file says something like scales fell from Saul's eyes. And Luke, the physician, does not explain the mechanism. He just reports what the eyewitness described. Saul got up, was baptized, ate, and within days was in the synagogues preaching the faith he had tried to bury. Here is the fourth finding, and it may be the center of the entire investigation. The hinge moments of this file keep turning on people nobody remembers. Ananias appears in this story for a dozen verses and vanishes. He wrote no epistles. He planted no famous churches. He did one thing. He obeyed a terrifying instruction and called his enemy brother. And because he did, the church got Paul, and the world got 13 letters. And you can argue that half the New Testament exists because one nameless-to-history believer was willing to knock on the wrong door. The chapter closes on a quieter frame, and it matters. Up the coast in Joppa, a disciple named Tabitha dies, a woman the file describes as always doing good and helping the poor. And when Peter arrives, the room is full of weeping widows, and they are holding something up to show him. Not her titles, not her theology, the robes and other clothing she had made while she was still with them. Her resume was wearable. Peter sends them out, prays, and gives the town back its seamstress alive. And notice who the evidence of a transformed life turned out to be. Again, widows. Clothing, needle, and thread. Ordinary goodness made visible. So the movement has now survived its own scattering and turned the scattering into a seedbed. It has crossed the Samaritan line, touched the African road, and swallowed its own worst enemy whole. But every border it has crossed so far, follow this carefully, has been a border out there. Hatreds between neighbors, exclusions written by other men. The last wall is different. The last wall runs through the middle of the believers themselves, through their kitchens, their tables, their deepest training in what is clean and what is not. God is about to ask this Jewish movement to walk through a Gentile's front door, and the man he picks for the job is going to argue with him from a rooftop 3 times, with the smell of lunch in the air. 2 men are praying, 30 miles apart, and neither one knows the other exists. The first is in Caesarea, the gleaming Roman port city on the coast. And he is the last person a Jerusalem believer would cast in this story. His name is Cornelius, and he is a centurion, an officer of the occupation, a man whose uniform means Rome, whose sword holds down the very people whose God he has fallen in love with. Because that is the strange thing about Cornelius. The file says he and his whole household fear God, that he gives generously to the poor, that he prays continually. A Roman officer praying to the God of a conquered nation. He is as close as an outsider can get, and he is still outside. There is a line he cannot cross, and everyone on both sides of it knows exactly where it is. The second man is in Joppa, down the coast, on a rooftop, and he is hungry. Peter, waiting for lunch, praying through the noon heat while the fish dries on the beach below and somebody's kitchen sends up the smell of food. And into that hunger comes a vision, a great sheet lowered from heaven, filled with animals, clean and unclean, tangled together. Pork and shellfish and everything a kosher lifetime had trained him never to touch. And a voice get up. Peter, kill and eat. And Peter, God bless him, Arges, surely not. Lord, stop and hear that sentence, because it is a grammatical car crash. Surely not. Lord, if he is Lord, you do not get surely not. If it is surely not, he is not your Lord. Peter has jammed a refusal and a surrender into 3 words. And every believer who has ever balked at a clear instruction has prayed some version of that prayer. And notice what Peter is refusing with, I have never eaten anything impure. His objection is his obedience. His resistance is built out of the most faithful material in his life. A lifetime of keeping the food laws that marked Israel out from the nations. That is what makes this wall the hardest one in the file. The walls in Samaria were built of old hatred. This wall is built of old faithfulness. 3 times the sheet comes down. 3 times the voice says, do not call impure what God has made clean. And while Peter is still puzzling over it, sandals hit the stairs below. 3 men at the gate, sent by a Roman centurion, asking for him by name. Now, feel the weight of the next morning's walk, because we skate over it. For Peter to enter a Gentile's house was not a minor social awkwardness. It was defilement, the kind of line-observant Jews of his world simply did not cross. And let us be careful here. Exactly as this file is careful. This is not a story about a narrow religion being corrected by a broad one. Everyone in this scene is Jewish, except Cornelius. The question tearing at Peter is not whether his faith is true. It is whether the mission he has been given is really as wide as it is starting to look. A community shaped by centuries of costly separation. Separation that had kept them alive under empire after empire. Is being asked whether the God who commanded the fences is now opening the gate. Peter walks through the door, and he says it out loud. With the bluntness of a fisherman, you know it is against our law for me to associate with a Gentile or visit him. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean. Anyone. Somewhere between the rooftop and the doorway. Peter understood the sheet was never about menu. It was about people. And then, while Peter is still preaching, before he can finish his sermon, before anyone is baptized, before a single condition can be attached, the Holy Spirit falls on that Gentile living room exactly the way he fell on the 120 at Pentecost. Luke's point is impossible to miss. Heaven did not wait for the paperwork. The Jewish believers who came with Peter are astonished. The file says, because the gift had been poured out even on Gentiles. Even. You can hear the wall cracking inside that one word. Peter comes home to Jerusalem and gets, not a parotid, but a committee hearing. The believers demand an explanation. You went into the house of uncircumcised men and ate with them. And Peter does not argue theology. He just tells the story. Step by step. Rooftop. Sheet. Messengers. Living room. Spirit. And lands on a question that should hang over every church door in America. Who was I to think that I could stand in God's way? And the room goes quiet. And then, the file says, they praised God. The community that could have split chose instead to be astonished together. And the wall, once cracked, kept crumbling. Word comes of something unprecedented up north in Antioch, the empire's third largest city. A melting pot of 500,000. Some of the scattered believers. Unnamed men from Cyprus and Cyrene, refugees from Stephen's persecution, had started telling Greeks about Jesus. Not strategists, not apostles, anonymous immigrants. And a great number believed. And suddenly there existed a congregation where Jew and Gentile ate at one table. Jerusalem sends Barnabas, the encourager, to inspect, and Barnabas takes one look and does two very Barnabas things. He rejoices, and he goes to Tarsus to find Saul, the converted persecutor everyone else is still afraid of, and puts him to work teaching. And it is there, in Antioch, that the neighbors coined a word for these people, because the old categories would not stretch. Not Jews exactly, not Greeks exactly. Something new, organized entirely around one name. They called them Christians, Christ people, and most scholars suspect it started as a street nickname, halfway to a sneer. The believers picked it up and wore it. Some names you choose. The truest ones get thrown at you. Then the file breaks its own momentum. Deliberately, brutally, King Herod Agrippa, hunting for popularity, arrests James, the brother of John, one of the inner three, a man who left his father's boat and his nets for this. And Luke gives his death one sentence. He had James put to death with the sword. No angle, no rescue, one line, and a fisherman is gone. And then Herod grabs Peter. Same city, same king, same sword, waiting. And this time an angel walks him out of the prison in the night, past 2 chains and 4 squads of guards. And Peter shows up at the door of the house where the church is praying for him. A servant girl named Rhoda answers, hears his voice, and is so overjoyed that she runs to tell everyone and leaves him standing in the street. The great escaped apostle, locked out by joy, knocking, while inside the prayer meeting tells Rhoda she is out of her mind. The file keeps her name in her fumble forever, and I love it for that. But do not let the comedy hide the question, because this is where an honest investigation has to slow down. James dead. 1 sentence. Peter delivered. 1 chapter. Same faith. Same city. Same week of prayers. The file offers no explanation. And a truthful record does not invent one. Whatever kept this movement going, it was not a guarantee of rescue. Because James's chair was empty, and they kept meeting anyway. So ask it again. The question this investigation was open to answer. James is gone. They keep going. What made them keep going? Hold the question. Because Antioch is about to do something no religious community had ever done. It is about to look at the 2 best teachers it has, the 2 men it can least afford to lose, and send them away. You have seen this body before, face down in the dirt outside the gates of Lystra, blood in the dust, a circle of believers standing over it like mourners at a grave. This is where our investigation began. The stoned man, The crowd that swung from worship to execution in 15 minutes. The corpse that got up and walked back through the gates. But now you know how he got here. And knowing changes everything. You know he was sent. That the church in Antioch fasted and prayed and heard the Spirit say, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul," and laid hands on their 2 best men and released them. You know the road that followed. Cyprus first. Barnabas's home island, where a Roman proconsul believed, and where Saul, somewhere on that island, starts going by his Greek name, Paul. You know the pattern that hardened city by city. Pisidian Antioch. Iconium preach in the synagogue. Watch some believe. Watch others rage. Get expelled. Walk to the next town. Start again. Grace and riot. Grace and riot. Like a heartbeat. And you know now why the stoning happened at all. It happened because Paul was winning. A crippled man in Lystra. Lame from birth. Exactly like the beggar at the beautiful gate. Stood up healed. And the pagan crowd reached for the only explanation their world offered. The gods have come down. And when Paul refused the sacrifice, tore his clothes, shouted, "We are only men," the disappointed crowd was ready kindling for the enemies who had followed him from 2 cities back. Adoration curdled to rage. The stones came out. So he is lying there, and the believers gather, and he gets up and walks back in, and the next day he leaves for Derbe, preaches there, wins a large number of disciples, and then, look at the itinerary. Because it is the maddest travel plan in the ancient world, he turns around and goes back. Lystra, Iconium, Pisidian Antioch, back through every city that just tried to kill him, strengthening the disciples, appointing elders, telling the new believers, "We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God." He could have taken the short road home through his own hometown. He chose the road with his blood already on it, because there were new churches on that road and nobody else to hold their hands. Then they sail home to Antioch and report the headline that will detonate everything. God has opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. Not a Gentile here and there. Not a Cornelius-sized exception. Whole congregations of them. Galatian towns, full of uncircumcised believers. Baptized, Spirit-filled, and eating at one table with Jews. And the detonation comes. Men arrive in Antioch from Judea. Sincere men. And they start teaching a correction unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses. You cannot be saved. Feel how reasonable it sounds from inside their skin. Circumcision was not a preference. It was the covenant sign God himself commanded to Abraham. The mark their ancestors had died, rather than abandon, under Antiochus. They are not villains. They are guardians. Asking the question, every growing movement must answer, does joining Jesus mean joining Israel first? Is there one door, or a door behind a door? The file says Paul and Barnabas got into sharp dispute and debate with them, and understand what is at stake in that argument. Because it is the hinge of Western history, and almost no one has heard of it. If the Judean teachers win, Christianity remains a renewal movement inside one nation, and the Gentile mission dies in its crib. If the question splits the church, the movement breaks in half at the exact moment of its fastest growth. A Jewish church and a Gentile church. 2 tables. Forever. Either way. The faith that reaches Rome, that reaches Luther, Wesley, that reaches the room you are sitting in. Never happens. Everything is on that table. So they took it to a meeting. Acts chapter 15. The Jerusalem Council. And I want you to resist every instinct that says a church committee cannot be a battlefield. The file says there was much discussion, and the Greek suggests the temperature was high. This was the establishment of the movement in one room. Apostles, elders, and a block of believers who were Pharisees, trained lawyers of the covenant, pressing their case. And then watch how the deadlock breaks. Because it does not break with a decree. It breaks with testimony. Peter stands and tells the Cornelius story one more time. The rooftop, the living room, the Spirit falling before he could finish his sermon, and lands his point. God, who knows the heart, made no distinction between us and them. Why are you trying to lay on their necks a yoke that neither we nor our fathers could carry? Then the whole assembly goes silent, and Barnabas and Paul simply narrate, city after city, signs and wonders among the Gentiles, evidence, witness, the same currency this movement has run on since the locked room. And the verdict comes from the last mouth anyone would script for it. James, the brother of Jesus, leader of the Jerusalem church, the most rigorously Torah-observant man in the room. The man the circumcision party would have counted as their anchor. He stands, cites the prophet Amos, that the Gentiles who bear God's name were always in the plan, and rules it is my judgment that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. No circumcision. A short letter asking Gentile believers to keep a few things that make shared tables possible. And one sentence in that letter that ought to stop you cold. It seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us, the church in the room, and the Spirit in the church, arriving at one mind, together. Here is the fifth finding of this investigation. This movement survived its most dangerous fight, not by avoiding the fight, and not by a strong man ending it, but by a room where witnesses were heard all the way out, where Scripture was reopened, and where the most conservative voice in the house chose the size of the mission over the comfort of his own side. The church did not split. The letter went out, and the file says the Gentile believers in Antioch read it and rejoiced. And then, because this record refuses to airbrush anyone, Luke reports what happened next between the two heroes of the hour, Paul and Barnabas, planning the return trip, fallout over a personnel question, whether to bring John Mark, the young assistant who had deserted them on the first journey. Barnabas, the second-chance man who once vouched for a murderer named Saul, wants to give Mark his second chance. Paul refuses. The file says the disagreement became so sharp that they parted company. Barnabas sailing for Cyprus with Mark, Paul heading north with Silas. The council that held the church together could not keep its own delegation together. Luke writes it down anyway. No varnish. And the mission, astonishingly, doubles its coverage even through the fracture. God, it seems, can steer even a broken partnership. So Paul walks north through Syria and Cilicia, back toward the scar tissue cities, picking up a young disciple named Timothy in, of all places, Lystra, fruit from the town that stoned him. The door to the Gentiles is open. The roads run west, and it is here, right here, on this stretch of the journey, that something happens inside the text itself. Something so quiet you could read past it, and so strange that scholars have leaned in close to it for 2,000 years. The investigator who has been writing this whole file, the careful physician narrating from a distance, they did this, they went there, is about to change a single pronoun, and with one word, step out from behind the camera, into his own story. Listen to 2 sentences from the file, back to back. Chapter 16, verse 8. So they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. They, The same distant, careful voice that has narrated everything since the locked room. They went, they preached, they sailed. 2 verses later, after Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia. No introduction, no announcement, and at this point Luke, joined the company. Just a pronoun, changing in the middle of a paragraph. The way a door opens in the middle of a house. For 15.5 chapters, our investigator has been standing behind the camera, interviewing witnesses, checking records, assembling testimony, and somewhere in the port city of Troas, on the Aegean coast, the physician met the mission, and the mission swallowed him whole. From this verse forward, whenever the pronoun says we, the file is no longer secondhand. The salt spray is on his own face. The prison stone is under his own sandals. The investigator has become a witness, and he will count heads on a sinking ship, because his own head is one of them. And look at what pulled the team across the water. Paul had been trying to go everywhere else. North into Bithynia, deeper into Asia. And the file says, with maddening brevity, that the Spirit would not allow them, doors closing, one after another, until the map had funneled them to the edge of the sea. Then, in the night, a vision, a man of Macedonia, standing, begging, come over and help us. And they sailed, and understand what that stretch of water was. On the far side of the Aegean lay Macedonia, Greece, Europe. The message was leaving Asia. Whatever your family tree looks like, if your ancestors came from the West, this boat is in your bloodline. Now watch how the gospel enters Europe, because it does not enter through a palace or a stadium. It enters through 3 people who could not be more different if a novelist had designed them. And it meets all 3 in one small Roman colony called Philippi. The first is a businesswoman. There were not even enough Jewish men in Philippi to form a synagogue. So, on the Sabbath, the team walks to the river, where a group of women has gathered to pray. And among them is Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. Purple was the empire's ultimate luxury good, dye harvested drop by drop from sea snails, cloth so expensive that emperors regulated who could wear it. Lydia is a merchant at the top of her market, a woman running her own house, her own trade, her own life. The file says the Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. She is baptized with her household. And then she does the most Lydia thing possible. She argues them into her home. If you consider me a believer, come stay at my house. And she persuaded us. Luke writes, us. He ate at her table. The first church in Europe met in the house of a businesswoman, planted at a riverbank prayer meeting with no men in attendance. The record does not underline it. The record just reports it and lets you notice. The second person is at the bottom of the same economy Lydia is at the top of. A slave girl with a spirit of divination, following the missionaries through the streets for days, shouting. Her owners are running her gift as a business, fortune-telling for cash. A girl whose voice makes money for men who own the voice. And Paul, the file says, finally turns and commands the spirit out of her, and it leaves. And here is the sentence Luke writes next. And it may be the most quietly damning line in the chapter. When her owners realized that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas. Not their slave is free. Not the girl is whole. The revenue is gone. They dragged the missionaries to the magistrates, dressed the charge up in patriotism. These Jews are throwing our city into an uproar. And the crowd joins in. And the magistrates have Paul and Silas stripped, beaten with rods, and locked in the inner cell with their feet in the stocks. Remember this scene. It is the first time in the file the gospel gets someone beaten for touching a revenue stream. It will not be the last. And the third person is the man holding the keys. The Philippian jailer was very likely a retired soldier, a man of the system, pension and orders. And his orders tonight are simple: guard them carefully. So he locks the bleeding men in the deepest cell. And at midnight, the file says, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns, and the other prisoners were listening. Of course they were listening. Backs laid open, feet in stocks, and the sound coming out of the punishment block is singing. Then the earthquake. Foundations shaking, every door open, every chain loose. The jailer wakes, sees the doors standing open, and draws his sword to kill himself. And you must know why, under Roman practice, a guard who lost his prisoners could expect to serve their sentence. And a soldier fell on his sword before he faced that disgrace. He is one thrust from ending it, when a voice roars out of the dark interior. Paul's voice: "Don't harm yourself. We are all here. We are all here. Free men, sitting in an open cell. Prisoners who stayed for the sake of the man who chained them." The jailer calls for lights, rushes in, trembling, falls down before them, and asks the question that has echoed out of that cell for 20 centuries, sirs. What must I do to be saved? That same night, the man washes the wounds his own system inflicted, and then is baptized in water, wound washer and washed, and sets a table. And the file says his whole house was filled with joy. In one city, the merchant at the top, the slave at the bottom, the officer in the middle. The gospel walked into Europe through a boardroom, a gutter, and a barracks, and made one family of the three. The road runs on, and the file keeps moving. Thessalonica, where the mob coins the phrase we opened this investigation with. These men who have turned the world upside down. Berea, where the listeners are called noble because they examine the scriptures daily to see if these things were true. Fact-checkers, the investigators' favorite congregation. Then Athens, the old university town, where Paul stands in the middle of the Areopagus, surrounded by 1,000 years of philosophy, and does something remarkable. He does not sneer. He quotes their own poets. He points to their own altar, inscribed to an unknown God, and says, "What you worship as unknown, I proclaim to you." He honors the search before he announces the finding. Some sneered back. A few believed. And Paul walked on to Corinth. And in Corinth, the file introduces the couple who may be the best argument for the thesis of this entire investigation. Aquila and Priscilla, Jewish refugees, expelled from Rome by decree of the Emperor Claudius, rebuilding from nothing. And they are tent makers, the same trade as Paul. So Paul moves in and works with them. Understand what that means. The apostle to the Gentiles spent his Corinthian years cutting and stitching leather at a workbench, and the faith spread across that workbench, across shared tools and shop talk and 18 months of ordinary Tuesdays. And after Paul sails on, this couple does something that proves what the workbench built. A speaker named Apollos arrives in Ephesus. Brilliant, Epilogue, mighty in the scriptures, and his theology has a gap. He knows only part of the story. Priscilla and Aquila do not correct him from the floor. They do not post a warning about him. The file says they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. 2 tent mockers, tutoring the most gifted preacher of the next generation, privately, over a meal, and Apollos receives it and becomes a force that waters what Paul planted. No stage, no title, a door, a table, and the patience to build a brother up instead of taking him down. Here is the sixth finding of this investigation. And by now, you can almost write it yourself. This stretch of the file, the Gospels leap into Europe, contains almost no stages. It contains thresholds, a riverbank, a cell door, a jailer's kitchen, Lydia's guest room, a tent-maker's shop, Apollos at a dinner table. The message crossed a continent on hospitality, on houses that opened faster than mouths. And the historian who recorded it could testify personally, because he had slept in those houses and eaten that bread. But every threshold the gospel crossed, it changed how somebody lived. And when enough people change how they live, they change how they spend. Philippi gave us the preview. 2 beaten backs over 1 slave girl's earnings. Now the mission is heading for Ephesus, the banking capital of Asia, home of one of the 7 wonders of the world and the industry that feeds on it. And in Ephesus, there is a silversmith who has started watching his numbers. His name is Demetrius, and Demetrius can do math. A craftsman is sitting with his accounts in Ephesus, and the accounts are telling him something he does not want to know. His name is Demetrius, and he is a silversmith. And to understand his problem, you have to understand his city. Ephesus was the showpiece of Roman Asia, 250,000 people, and its beating heart was the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, 4 times the footprint of the Parthenon, columns like a marble forest. But the temple was not just a shrine. It was the region's bank, where fortunes were deposited under the goddess's protection. It was the anchor of a pilgrimage economy, festivals that flooded the city with visitors every year. And every visitor wanted a souvenir, a silver shrine, a miniature Artemis for the household altar. Demetrius makes those. His guild makes those. Half the workshops in the city eat from that table. Innkeepers, dew sellers, sculptors, priests. Artemis of the Ephesians is not just a religion. She is an industry. And for 2 years now, something has been eating the market. Paul had come to Ephesus and settled in, teaching daily in a rented lecture hall. And the file says the word spread until the whole province of Asia heard it. And the message was doing what the message does, rearranging lives. And rearranged lives rearrange budgets. Luke gives us the receipt. A number of Ephesian believers who had practiced sorcery, and Ephesus was famous for it. Magic scrolls, spells, incantations sold under the counter, brought their scrolls together and burned them publicly. And Luke, the investigator, the man who recorded a beggar's age and counted a ship's passengers, records the appraisal when they calculated the value of the scrolls. The total came to 50,000 drachmas. A drachma was a day's wage, 50,000 days, roughly 135 years of a working man's pay. And follow this carefully, because it is the detail that matters. Nobody confiscated those scrolls. No apostle demanded a bonfire. The believers burned their own assets, voluntarily, because they had found something that made the old power not worth keeping. You could have resold those scrolls. Fire is not resale. Fire is verdict. Demetrius saw that bonfire, or heard about it, and he understood what it meant faster than the theologians did. So he calls a meeting of the guild, and Luke preserves his speech. And I want you to hear how it is built, because it is one of the most honest speeches in the Bible. Honest in what it puts first. Men, you know, we receive a good income from this business. That is the opening line. Income. First sentence. First concern. Then, and only then, there is danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited. Read the order of operations, our income, our trade's reputation. And then, third, the goddess. Demetrius has told you exactly what is sacred here. And it is not Artemis. Faith gets recruited as the bodyguard of revenue. It was not the last time. The speech works. Fury catches, spills into the streets, and the city rushes, as one man, into the great theater. A stone bowl carved into the mountainside that seated 25,000. You can still stand in it today, and for 2 solid hours. 25,000 voices chant the same 7 words. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. 2 hours, and in the middle of the mayhem, Luke drops one of the driest sentences ever written by a historian. Most of the people did not even know why they were there. The crowd assembled, in confusion, some shouting one thing, some another, a riot in search of its own reason. If you have watched a modern outrage cycle, you have seen this theater. The technology changed. The crowd did not. Notice what finally calms it, not the gospel, not a miracle, but a city bureaucrat, the town clerk, warning that Rome does not tolerate unexplainable riots, and everyone could be charged. Cold imperial procedure clears the theater in minutes. And notice what the uproar never claimed. Nobody in that theater stood up and said the message was false. The complaint, from the first syllable of Demetrius's speech, was that the message was working. When a faith starts changing how people live and spend, the beneficiaries of the old order will feel it in the ledger before they ever argue it in the forum. And they will call their ledger a goddess. And then the file does something it has done before, at exactly the right moment. It cuts the noise. Paul leaves Ephesus, travels through Macedonia and Greece, and begins working his way back east. And he is done pretending about where the road ends. He is going to Jerusalem, carrying a relief offering for the poor. And every prophetic voice along the route is saying the same thing. Chains are waiting. On the way, his ship puts in at Miletus, a day's ride from Ephesus, and he sends for the elders of the Ephesian church, the men he spent 3 years building, and they come down to the beach, and Paul says goodbye. Read Acts 20 when you want to see the apostle with his armor off. No crowd now, no lecture hall, just a huddle of men by the water. He reminds them that he served among them with tears, that he worked with these hands to pay his own way, that for 3 years he never stopped warning each of them night and day. He tells them the truth about his itinerary. I am going to Jerusalem, not knowing what will happen to me there. Only that in every city the Spirit warns me that prison and hardships are facing me. And then the sentence that measures the man, yet I consider my life worth nothing to me, if only I may finish the race and complete the task of testifying to the good news of God's grace. He quotes a saying of Jesus that appears nowhere in the 4 Gospels. Preserved only here. Only in this beach farewell. It is more blessed to give than to receive. And the file says they all wept openly as they embraced him and kissed him. What grieved them most? Luke writes, and he was standing on that beach, was his statement that they would never see his face again. Then they walked him to the ship. That is the frame to hold as this act of the file closes. Not the invincible apostle, silencing 25,000. A tired man on a beach, held by weeping friends. Who knows, he is sailing toward handcuffs. And boards anyway. The question of this investigation has never been louder than it is in that embrace. He can see the chains from here. What made him keep going? The ship sails east. Jerusalem is waiting, and Jerusalem does exactly what everyone was afraid it would do. There is a man being carried up a stone staircase, by Roman soldiers. Because the crowd below is trying so hard to kill him that his feet cannot touch the ground. Jerusalem. Feast season. The temple courts packed, and the rumor had gone off like a spark in dry straw. This is the man who teaches against our people and our law, and he has defiled the holy place. It was not true. But riots do not run on fact checks. We learned that in Ephesus, the mob seized Paul, dragged him out of the temple, and was beating him to death in the outer court when the Roman garrison came down from the fortress at a run. The commander clapped him in 2 chains, and the crush of bodies was so violent that the soldiers ended up carrying Paul up the steps of the barracks, the crowd surging below, screaming the same words. Another crowd screamed in that city 30 years earlier, "Away with him." And on those stairs, bleeding, one arrest away from safety, Paul turns to the commander and makes a request that tells you everything about the man. Not, "Get me out of here." He says, "May I speak to the people?" The man the mob just tried to lynch wants the microphone to address the mob. And standing on those steps, in the language of the crowd, he gives them his story. Damascus, the light, the voice, and they listen. Actually listen. Right up until the sentence where God says, "I will send you far away to the Gentiles." That word, the room detonates again. Cloaks in the air, dust flying, and Paul goes into Roman custody. And the door of that custody is not going to open again for years. Now, the file spends 5 full chapters on what happens next. Hearings and transfers and courtrooms. And I am going to do with them what an investigator does with repetitive testimony. Find the pattern. Because the pattern is the point. 4 times, Paul stands before power, before the Sanhedrin, the same council that tried Jesus. Peter, Stephen, before Felix, the Roman governor, before Festus, his successor, before King Agrippa, great-grandson of the Herod who tried to murder the infant Jesus. 4 different rooms, and in every single one, the same reversal. The trial of Paul quietly turns into the trial of the audience. The defendant keeps testifying. The judges keep squirming. Watch Felix, a governor with a corrupt streak and a guilty conscience. And the file says he sent for Paul frequently and listened to him, hoping for a bribe. Except, listen to what Paul chose for his prison lecture's righteousness. Self-control. And the judgment to come, to the man who could free him. No flattery. No hints about payment. Just justice and judgment preached to a judge. And Luke records that Felix became afraid and said, "That's enough for now. You may leave." The prisoner preaches. The governor flees the room. Who exactly is in chains? And then the file writes the hardest sentence in this whole stretch. And it is hard precisely because of how quiet it is. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. 2 years. 1 sentence. 2 years of a cell in Caesarea. No angle. No earthquake. No midnight rescue like Philippi. Felix keeping the case open as a favor to politics. The calendar just eating itself. And I want to sit in that sentence for a moment. Because somebody watching this is living in it. You had a mission, a calling, a direction, and then life put you in a waiting room and lost your file. And the months went by, and heaven went quiet. The book of Acts does not skip that experience. The man who wrote 1/4 of your New Testament spent those years watching a door that did not open. And the file does not pretend the waiting was secretly exciting. It just testifies that the waiting was not the end. God's work in Acts does not pause when the plot does. Festus arrives, wants to gift Jerusalem a favor by sending Paul back into the ambush waiting on that road. And Paul plays the one legal card a Roman citizen holds. I appeal to Caesar. To Rome. Then, but first, one more hearing. The grandest of them all. King Agrippa and his sister Bernice entering the audience hall. Luke says, with great pomp, gold and purple and officers, to examine a chained tent maker. And Paul tells the story one more time. Damascus, the light, the commission, and then he does the thing no defendant does. He goes on offense. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. And the king, cornered between the prophets and the room, answers with the most famous dodge in the New Testament. Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? And Paul's reply comes back with chains audibly in it, short time or long. I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am. Except for these chains. Look at that sentence. The man in the irons pities the men in the purple. He is the only free person in the room. And everyone in the room can feel it. And when the pomp files out, Luke carefully records the verdict of the corridor conversation. The third such verdict in the file. This man is not doing anything that deserves death or imprisonment. He could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. 3 Roman examinations. 3 findings of innocence. The investigator wants that on the record this movement was never a crime. It was something the empire had no category for. A kingdom that kept walking through courtrooms without breaking any laws. Here is the 7th finding of the investigation. Paul lost control of his own life, his itinerary, his freedom, his years, and the mission did not lose a single day. In chains. His testimony entered chambers. No free missionary could have booked governors' halls. A king's court. And next, because of the appeal, the imperial capital itself. The empire thought it was transporting a prisoner. It was paying the freight on its own evangelization. So, Rome. Then, there is just one obstacle left. And it is not legal. It is the Mediterranean Sea. In late autumn, the season when sensible sailors tie up their ships and wait for spring, because the sea lanes close, and the storms that close them have names. Day 11. No sun, no stars. Hold what that means on an ancient ship, because it is not a mood. It is a death sentence, in slow motion. No compass exists, no instruments. Sun and stars are the only navigation there is, and the sky has been shut for 11 days, which means 276 human beings are somewhere on the Mediterranean, and not one of them, not the captain, not the owner, not the centurion in charge, knows where. The ship is a big Alexandrian grain freighter. Egypt's wheat bound for Rome's bread lines, and she has been caught since Crete in a storm the sailors know by name. The Eurakilo, the northeaster. They have run cables under the hull and cranked them tight to keep her timbers from springing apart. Day 2. They threw the cargo overboard. Day 3. The ship's own tackle. With their own hands. Luke says. And then the sentence that ends the paragraph, like a stone dropping down a well, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. We? Remember the pronoun. The investigator is not reconstructing this from interviews. He threw gear over the rail with his own hands. He gave up hope with everybody else. That number, 276, is exact because the man counting was soaked and starving on that deck. And he counted because he was one of them. And out of that hopelessness stands up the least authorized man on board. The prisoner. Paul had warned them back in Crete not to sail, and been overruled. The centurion listened to the pilot and the owner instead. Expertise in capital. And who could blame him? Now, in the dark of the storm's second week. With the crew, past caring, Paul stands up amidships and says, "I told you so," and then immediately redeems it. "Keep up your courage. Not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed." An angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me last night and said, "Do not be afraid. Paul, you must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me." And here is the strange thing. The thing the file lets you watch happen. They listen. Nobody voted. No mutiny transferred command. But from that speech forward, the functional captain of that ship is the man in custody. When the sailors try to slip away in the lifeboat under cover of a fake anchor run, it is Paul who catches it and tells the centurion. And this time, the centurion obeys the prisoner and cuts the boat loose. And on the 14th night, with land somewhere in the dark and dawn coming, Paul does something so ordinary it breaks your heart. He tells 276 exhausted, terrified people to eat. "You have gone 14 days without food." He says, "Take some. You will need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head." And then, in front of them all, pagan sailors and soldiers and prisoners, he took bread, gave thanks to God, broke it, and began to eat. And the file says they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. No sermon, bread, thanksgiving, and a calm man eating breakfast in a hurricane. And courage moved through that ship like warmth. Sometimes the most powerful witness on the worst night of everyone's life is simply the person who still knows how to give thanks. Daylight, a bay, a beach, a run for shore, the bow grinding into a sandbar, the stern breaking up in the surf, and then the last threat. And it is not the sea. The soldiers plan to kill the prisoners. Standard procedure. No escapes on my watch. And the centurion, wanting to spare Paul's life, wanting to spare the man who had saved all of theirs, forbids it. Planks and wreckage, swimmers and clingers, and then Luke counts them up the beach. And the count comes out even. 276 aboard. 276 ashore. The ship was destroyed. Exactly as promised. The people were not. Exactly as promised. The island was Malta, and the file's affection for what happened there is audible. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. Luke writes, building a fire in the rain for the shipwrecked strangers. And Paul, apostle to the Gentiles, carrier of the message that is reordering the empire, gathers brushwood, feed the fire, do the next ordinary thing, and out of the brushwood, driven by the heat, a viper fastens on his hand, and the islanders' theology kicks in instantly. This man must be a murderer. Justice has caught him. They watch him. Luke notes with a physician's eye for the clinical detail, expecting him to swell up or suddenly fall dead. Paul shakes the snake into the fire. Nothing happens, and the crowd swings. In one afternoon, from he is a murderer to he is a god. The exact same pendulum we watched in Lystra at the beginning of this investigation. Adoration and execution. Two faces of the same crowd. Some things about human beings the file never lets you forget. Then the quiet miracle that closes the island. The father of Publius, the chief official, is sick in bed. And Luke names the illness with the precision of his profession. Fever and dysentery. And Paul goes in, prays, lays hands on him, heals him. And then the sick of the whole island start coming. 3 months of winter on Malta. And when the company finally sails for Rome on another grain ship, the islanders load them with every supply they need. The storm took everything. The mission never missed a step. And so, at last, up the Appian Way, Rome, believers from the city, hearing Paul is coming, walk 30 and 40 miles south just to meet him on the road. And the file says that at the sight of them, Paul thanked God and was encouraged. Even the apostle needed faces. Even the man who survived the Euraquilo needed friends walking out to meet him. Now here is where 20 centuries of readers have braced for the finale. 28 chapters of momentum. The courtroom of Caesar waiting. The trial of the age. And Luke gives us what? No trial. No Caesar. No verdict. No martyrdom scene. No triumphant vindication. Here is the entire ending of the book of Acts. For 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. He proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ, with all boldness and without hindrance. That is it. A rented house, a prisoner chained by the wrist, day and night, to a rotating shift of Roman guards. Imagine being assigned that duty roster, chained for 8 hours to Paul of Tarsus, and a door that never closed. Jewish leaders came, and he reasoned with them from morning till evening. Seekers came. Friends came. Luke was there. The pronoun tells us. And the last word of the book, in the Greek, Luke wrote, is a single adverb akoleitos, unhindered. Put the 2 rooms side by side now. The way the investigator built his whole file to make you do. Chapter 1, a room in Jerusalem. Door locked from the inside. 120 people hiding from the world. Chapter 28, a room in Rome. A guard on the door. Chains on the teacher. And the door standing open to the world. In the first room, free people afraid to speak. In the last room, a chained man who cannot be shut up. The man is bound. The message is unhindered. That is the entire journey of the book, told in 2 doorways. And now the investigation can close its question. The one we opened over a body outside the gates of Lystra. What made them keep going? The file has ruled out the easy answers. Not fearlessness. We watch them hide, argue, flinch, split up. Not perfection. We read the pages about Ananias's lie and the widows in the food line and the fight that broke up Paul and Barnabas. Not guaranteed rescue. James's chair is still empty. And Stephen's. And the 2 years in Caesarea really were 2 years. What is left standing in the evidence is this. These people were convinced that the tomb was empty as a matter of witnessed fact. They had met a presence. The Spirit, who kept proving realer than their fear. And they believed the mission belonged to God and not to them, which meant their failures could slow it, but never sink it. People who believe those 3 things can lose their plans, their freedom, their safety, and their lives, and still not believe the story has failed. That is not courage as the world builds it. That is certainty about a Sunday morning, working itself out through ordinary nervous systems, one costly obedience at a time. They kept going because they were witnesses, and a witness cannot unsee. One last observation from the file, and it is about the ending, because the ending has bothered readers for 2,000 years. And it should. Luke almost certainly knew how Paul's story ended. Most scholars agree he wrote after the events, and church memory is unanimous that Paul died under Nero, most likely a sword outside Rome. Luke was a meticulous writer, a man who recorded a beggar's age, a bribe-hungry governor's stall tactics, the exact passenger count of a doomed ship. He does not run out of ink by accident. He looked at the death of his hero, his friend, his traveling companion, and left it out. He ended the book early, on purpose, with a door standing open, Liddy, and an adverb hanging in the air. Unhindered. Why does a careful historian refuse to finish his story? There is really only one answer. Because the story was not finished. The book of Acts is the only book in your Bible that does not conclude. It just stops, mid-motion, like a report on something still happening. The Gospel of Luke ends with a resurrection and an ascension. A real ending. Acts ends with an open door. Because Acts is not the biography of Peter. And it is not the biography of Paul. Both of them exit the record without an obituary. Acts is the case file of a witness that outlives its witnesses. Every generation that read it added pages. Luke never saw the copies of the copies. The churches in the catacombs. The message crossing to lands no Roman map even showed. Until one of those late, far-flung pages turned out to have your language on it. And then your century. And then this room. The 120 in the upper room were nobody. That was the finding of this whole investigation. The thing the witnesses themselves kept saying, unschooled. Ordinary men. The council sneered. And the council was right. A food line administrator preached the sermon that got heaven's attention. A nameless believer knocked on the most dangerous door in Damascus and made half the New Testament possible. A cloth merchant. A jailer. 2 tent makers. An island of strangers feeding a fire in the rain. The file is 28 chapters of world-changing history, with almost no famous people in it. Because the power was never in the resumes, which is why the record ends unfinished. It ends unfinished because it was never finally about them. Chapter 29 is not in the book. Friend, it is in the room where you are sitting.